What is going on to all my Barry fans out there, and welcome back to my channel, MovieFiles. We are back breaking down this fourth and final season of Barry, and we're talking episode 6, which was titled The Wizard. Now, in this episode, we catch up to the characters that we missed last week and see what they've been up to in the past 8 years. Sally and John loses their protector as Barry seeks approval for his sins, and speaking of Barry, he finally meets his match. There was so much that went down tonight's episode. I'm so excited to be back with you all, but first, let's talk in the comments. I know last week, reading the comment section, a lot of you all were somewhat split or divisive about last week's episode. So did you feel like this episode was kind of a return to form as we get the other characters involved? Let me know how you felt about Hank and his relationship with the Raven. What's going on with the return of Gene and catching up with his life? We got Barry trying to look for approval. We have Sally and John losing their minds. And that ending, let me know your thoughts, your theories, your predictions of what you all hope to see in the final 2 episodes of this last season of Barry in the comments below. And of course, if you all appreciate today's review, consider hitting the like button, sharing today's breakdown, and of course, consider subscribing to the channel. With that being said, we got an episode to break down. Full spoilers ahead. As Barry prepares to leave to go back to LA, he attempts to prepare Sally for the worst case scenario and times her in assembling a gun to protect herself while he's gone. Now, this next line might not mean anything particularly, but when we see Barry saying to Sally that boys instinctively know how to use guns and how to drive cars, that to me might be foreshadowing to what might be a tragic ending to Barry and this made-up family that he's created. Now, really appreciated Sally in this scene as she confirms a question that I had in last week's episode. When there's maybe some heat or maybe some unwarranted attention on the Berkman family, they do decide to leave these different areas that they have lived in the past 8 years. So I really appreciate that confirmation there. And also, just speaking to the Sally of it all in this scene, she refuses to put this gun together and makes some really good points on Barry's decision on killing Gene. As she says, you're gonna kill him and you think this is gonna kill the movie? And I'm with Sally in this moment 100%, because if anything, the Hollywood system would probably be more interested in making this movie after one of the lead characters actually dies in real life. Now, going back into this scene here, we see Barry lets her know that he only wants to kill Gene and no one else attached to this film, because the movie would come out and it'd be from Gene's point of view, which to Barry isn't the actual truth. And of course, he doesn't want John to ultimately see this movie one day. Barry's logic is definitely flawed here, and I believe that there's more complexities to his reasons why. I personally believe that deep down, Barry does want to kill him because, one, that's just who Barry is. He's a killer, but also he looked up to Gene, and he was ultimately left disappointed and devastated when he learned that Gene betrayed him, and even Sally points this out in this scene. Now, we see Sally plays the God card on Barry as this goes against his newfound connection with God and goes against his message of killing because it's a big sin. Now, we see this doesn't stop Barry as he gives Sally their only 2 options. Option 1 being either he killed Gene, or option B, they drop John off at an orphanage and they unalive themselves. Now, as we see, Sally brings up the fact that John doesn't even know their real names, but Barry counters with John knowing the real her. Now, to me, Barry is just so blinded by this false narrative that he's created in this made-up fantasy of this happy life, because he's so far down the rabbit hole, he doesn't even realize that Emily is exactly who John sees. I don't believe John has ever met the real version of Sally. As we see, Clark says his goodbyes and leaves John with a prayer, as Emily is tasked with not leaving the home and attending to all their son's needs. We see John clearly doesn't want to spend the day with his mom, as Clark promises that he'll return soon. Now, I'm pretty sure that this is most likely the only time that Emily and John have spent time together without Clark being around, and I'm also pretty confident that this is the first time in 8 years that Barry hasn't been around to keep Sally safe. As it's time to shine a light in the sky as the Raven is set free to spread his wings to fly, we cut to the Raven tatted up from head to toe as he's now officially out of jail. As I predicted weeks ago back in episode 4, that Fuchs got the gang and the family he wanted, but more importantly, he also gained a lot of respect from not just the inmates but also the guards, as he didn't snitch on Barry, and we see him fully embracing the Raven persona. We see how much confidence he's gained in the last 8 years. We see him walk into a coffee shop. He manages to get the barista to instantly drop everything that she has going on, and she falls in love with him after he gave her just one simple look. As we see the Raven heads over to No Hold Ball to meet Hank, who's also now claiming to be a changed person as he's built this empire that him and Cristobal once spoke of. We see Hank hasn't completely forgotten about his love, as Cristobal has a golden statue of himself for everyone to see. We have Fuchs seeing the journey displayed at No Hold Ball of Hank's rise to power, as we see that Hank has ran with the idea that Cristobal came up with to monetize the sand mining and creating this lucrative business. Hank still has his joyful personality as he pretends to be happy to see that the Ravens return, as he's ready to work for Hank, but he's got some demands on their new partnership. He wants him and his crew to be put up in Hank's best property, but the top priority is finding Barry. Hank tells him that Barry is old news and he's most likely dead, and he's moved on, and he suggests that the Raven does the same, but the Raven doesn't care. He just wants Barry to be delivered to him. Now, personally, I don't believe for a second that Hank has forgotten or moved on from Barry. And with Hank running LA, there's no way he didn't get word that Barry's back in town. Now we see this beautiful property with amazing views and an infinity pool and of course a crow's nest as Hank gets the Raven crew all set up, plus he does let him know that he'll be looking into finding Barry. But more important in this scene, Fuchs finds out from Hank that Gene is back in town, which I believe that the Raven will be looking for Gene in the coming episodes. Now speaking of Gene, we see him in this episode trying to pick up the pieces after missing for the last 8 years, as we have him meeting with the WB executive and we learn a little bit about the plot of the Barry Berkman movie. Now it's pitched as a thriller and a game of cat and mouse between the student and the teacher, and that Barry will be the lead of this film, not Gene. Instead, he will be the hero that defeats Barry. Now Gene isn't impressed by this pitch, and he actually knew that this was probably the direction the studio was going to take, as he claims he's a changed man and he's found true happiness in Israel, and he doesn't want this movie to be made. Now, part of me thinks that once she said that he wasn't going to be the lead of the movie, that was the thing that caused him for this movie not to be made. Now, part of me thinks that once she said that Gene wasn't going to be the lead of this movie, that was what caused him to say that he didn't want this movie to be made. Now, as I was watching all these characters maneuver in this episode, they're acting as though that the past 8 years they have changed, but honestly, I don't think none of them have truly changed. They're all pretending, and deep down, they're still the same terrible, selfish people they were 8 years ago. And in fact, I believe that once they were all kind of aware that they were still existing and they were still alive, that was when their true intentions came back to light. Gene continues to stay on his high ground, and he tells the studio representative that this whole project is a mindless entertainment thing and that it glorifies a psychopath and that it exploits the woman that he loved. Now again, I'm calling BS, but let me know if you feel Gene was being genuine in this episode. We know Hollywood's going to do what they do, which is they don't need the consent of Gene. They're going to make this movie with or without him, as he claims that he's going to take them to court and fight them against this, which, speaking of court, we have a representative from the DA office gather Gene for a meeting. At this meeting, we learn that Leo survived the shooting and that the DA truly had no idea where Barry was the last 8 years, as Gene continues to say that he came out of hiding to make sure that Barry doesn't get immortalized. Now, I want to point out that I thought it was just so interesting to see the parallel between Barry coming out of hiding to stop Gene from telling his side of the story. Meanwhile, Gene came out of hiding to stop Barry's story from getting out. I just thought that was a very interesting parallel throughout this episode. We get this important conversation between Leo and Gene as he explains his reasons why he's coming out of hiding to kill this Barry movie, but he also doesn't want the attention to him and his family. Now, I've personally always felt bad for Leo, especially getting shot, but in this scene, it just hit me that Gene and Sally are just seriously the worst parents. He's such a terrible father to Leo, which is definitely a central theme to this season. Bad parenting and watching these parents spread their brokenness down to their kids. Now, meanwhile, from the Barry perspective, we see him walking up to the house and he stops because he sees Leo's son. Now, I think the reason Barry Barry stop is because he was probably thinking of John, and he's already taken so many people that he's killed in his past away from their loved ones. Plus, we know that Leo and his son has nothing to do with Barry's plans on killing Jean. Now, it's so interesting to me to see this complicated relationships between the fathers and their son highlighted in this episode in particular, whether you look at Barry leaving his son John, Leo and Jean, as well as Leo's son maybe not understanding why Leo is just seamlessly accepting his father back in his life. Now let's go back and talk about John and Emily, as we see that she is just completely out of touch as a mother as she tries to get John to feel better about Clark leaving. Now, after failing to make a simple grilled cheese sandwich, we see that she decides to give her son alcohol to change his mood, as we know that that's something that she does when she's not in a good mood. Now, you see John is completely knocked out, he's wasted, he's not moving, he doesn't want to get up, and Sally just goes into the other room to take a nap. Now, this is where things get very, very interesting. In comes who I believe to be Bevel and maybe one of his friends seeking revenge from him getting fired in last week's episode. Now, Sally hears someone in her sleep and she goes to check on it, but she just believes it's the wind coming into the house, and we get a legit jump scare, as I believe, again, this is probably Bevel or one of his friends, all dressed in black. They have a black mask, and watching this person creeping around the house and following her to the bedroom was like legit creepy in my opinion. Now, ultimately, this person locks her in the room from the outside. And listen, I'm not exactly sure what happens next because we hear this commotion going on. Someone gets poked in the eye. John's still asleep. Meanwhile, Sally's trying to get the gun. She's in a panic mode. And then the house gets hit by a truck. They drive off, and all this is happening, and John is still asleep. Now, in this moment, I was 100% sure that someone was going to die. It didn't happen, obviously, but I do think that will happen probably by the end of the show. But the question is, did this actually happen, or was this maybe a metaphor for Sally, her literally living in a broken home in her eyes, especially without Barry being there to protect them? Now, assuming this is real, because going back to last week's episode, when Barry stayed up all night after someone knocked on their door, and again, assuming that that person that knocked on her door was Bevel, who was most likely following Emily back home to find out where she lived, or again, was this maybe in her head? Now, I say that because we've seen Sally in this season. She's had these nightmares of that person she killed in last season, the biker. His ghost followed her in, I believe, 2 previous episodes this season. So was it maybe the ghost that haunts her? Was it Bevel? Was it real? Let me know what you all thought about that scene as we see her calling Barry to come home, and John finally wakes up. We've been talking about Barry the whole time. Let's check in on him on this episode, who is discovering if murder is not a sin. We see as Barry is traveling back to LA, we have him going throughout this episode, listening to these different pastors speaking on what it means to sin. But not just any sin, but in particularly what it means to murder someone, which automatically to me shows that at least in the last 8 years, Barry has probably been the only character that's attempted to change his old ways, and he thinks that he left the paths behind him. Because as we'll discuss, there's moments in this episode that he questions if he really truly wants to sin again, if he wants to kill again, but secretly, I think he can't shut that part off inside of him completely. I got a kick out of him seeking just one approval from one of those pastors, regardless of what their message was or their intentions. He just wanted that one yes, and we got some of the most comedic moments in this episode, especially when he's going to get the gun and we get the line, "You can't just kill anyone that crosses you. That's murder, and you will definitely go to hell." That moment there just absolutely took me out. That was such a funny moment. But he heads over, like I said earlier, to Jean's son's house, Leo, waiting for him to arrive. And again, we talked about that, breaking down the scene. But as he was driving up, when he was listening to the radio about that pastor who used to be a hockey player and served 10 years in prison. But the thing that he got out of that scene was he finally got that approval that he was looking for. And again, in that scene, the key thing that happened was Barry was just truly seeking a sign from God, and he got that sign. This was his time to get his revenge on Jean. As we end the episode, as the theme of watching these characters creating their own perfect lives, we see that the Raven is celebrating with his new family, his barista partner, and now he has a daughter. As the Raven is drunk off his ass, he's going on and on and on about Hank's new empire, and he didn't know that Hank had it in him, and he didn't know that he was able to create this empire. But then he crosses the line by saying that he didn't know that Hank had it in him to have Cristobal killed, and everyone knows about it. Now, this clearly upsets Hank because because he's clearly in denial, as is everyone else in this show, and this leads him to ending the deal with the Raven. Now the question is this deal really dead, or will we see the Raven try to kill Hank, or will Hank try to kill the Raven? Which, speaking of killing, my favorite part of this episode, we have Barry now following Gene back to his house, and it appears that everything is going as smoothly as possible as we see Gene walks in and leaves the door wide open. Almost feel like a trap, right? But Barry doesn't see it as a trap. Instead, this is the sign that Barry has been looking for from God. This is his opportunity to kill the man that he loved and ultimately betrayed him. As we see, Gene's calling for Tom, and he's walking around kind of aimlessly. As Barry gets closer to the door, he ultimately opens the door, and out of nowhere, he's taken down from behind. As we cut to Barry being tied up to a chair, and we notice that this is a very familiar garage, as is no other than the garage of Jim Moss, and this was the moment I've been waiting for. We're gonna see Jim Moss doing what he does best, which is breaking down people and getting his justice for his daughter's death, Janice. By the way, I want to point out that black does not crack. I mean, my man Jim has aged 8 years and looks exactly the same. But in all seriousness, I do want to go back to this scene and talking about Jim. If you look behind him in the scene, it appears that he's mapped out all the various different characters that might have led him to finding Barry at this exact point at Jim's house. Or, speaking of Gene, maybe him and Jim are working together, because as I mentioned last week, maybe Gene knew coming out of hiding that inevitably Barry would come to go look for him. So do we believe that Jim and Gene are maybe working together and they're doing the same thing that they did to Barry in the season 3 finale? Let me know if you all were thinking the same thing. Or I'm going to connect this to the Raven and also connect this to the idea of Barry seeking signs from God. If you all go back to season 3, I believe it was episode 6, which was titled 719N. In that episode, we saw Fuchs was willing to put all this behind him. He was going to forgive Barry, but then he was in that person's truck and he saw the picture of Gene and Barry, and in his eyes, that was a sign from God, but also all the hate towards Barry and Gene came rushing back. So I wouldn't be surprised, not that maybe Jim and Gene are working together, but maybe Jim and Fuchs, aka the Raven, are working together. What do you all think about that? Let me know in the comment section. But this is exactly what I want to see. I've been mentioning this for weeks now, that I want to see a scene between Barry and Jim and see if he could break Barry and see if he could maybe get behind the reasons why he killed Janice. Also get some information on why Barry wanted to be a hitman and all his killings, and maybe we'll see this explosive scene between Barry and him. Maybe Barry's going to end up killing him, or maybe going back to the Wizard. We know that Jim managed to make people unalive themselves, so will we see him trying to convince Barry to take his own life? And also, can we talk about this? Where the heck is Albert? Is Albert going to appear in the final 2 episodes? Will the Raven save his best friend Barry? Let me know in the comments below. Now, I know we only have 2 weeks left, and I know you all weren't the biggest fan of last week's episode, but again, in the comments, let me know if you feel like this was the return to the old form. We catch up with all the characters. We have this explosive ending. How did you all feel about this episode? Let me know in the comment section. Thank you all for watching today's breakdown. I can't believe we only have 2 episodes left, and I'm pretty sure these last episodes, I hope they are fantastic episodes. But again, let me know your pros, your cons, your thoughts, your theories for the weeks ahead. And again, if you all appreciate today's commentary, just a reminder to hit the like button, share today's review, and of course, consider subscribing to the channel. You all are awesome. Hope you're staying safe. As you can see on the screen now, come enjoy this community. Check out my reviews for the other episodes of Barry. Check out my most recent breakdown, and we'll catch you all on the next video.